I spent some of the first years of my life in Japan, where my parents were missionaries. Though we left when I was only 3 years old, I still have memories of Tokyo and those who babysat me. I always felt disturbed then when going to school in the UK, my history classes debated whether the atomic bombings ended the war. I could not so easily dismiss the lives of Japanese people as collateral damage. I could imagine people in the casualty statistics. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed more than 200,000 people in 1945, including Korean coerced laborers and Allied prisoners of war. Those who survived, the hibakusha as they are called, have suffered radiation-related diseases, including cancers, heart disease, infertility, as well as social stigma. Allied troops from the USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Nepal, and pre-partition India were also deployed to the hazardous zones after World War II ended. Health effects of the bombings have been passed down to children and grandchildren. From the very beginning of the nuclear age, then, the harm of nuclear weapons has been indiscriminate and multinational. The late Charles D. Neff, a leader in the religious tradition in which I was raised, the Community of Christ, was an officer in the US Navy at the time of the atomic bombings. He deployed with the occupation forces to Hiroshima 3 weeks after the blast. And in a 1982 sermon, he recalled that the horror he witnessed convinced him that the fashioning of nuclear weapons and threatening to use them is a sin against God, a sin against God's likenesses, all humans, and against God's creation. The risk of nuclear weapons is not solely in the past. 9 countries have some 15,000 nuclear weapons, many on high alert, able to be launched in minutes. The vast majority belong to the United States and Russia. There's a horrifying history of accidents, close calls, mechanical and human error. Those of us who live in nuclear-armed states may be at most at threat from our own nuclear weapons. They are inherently unstable pieces of machinery that can fail like any technology. Just imagine how often your computer crashes. That's why abstract theories of deterrence fall apart when you examine them rigorously. Sometimes when we speak to audiences, we describe to them what would happen if a nuclear device detonated in their own town. However, we have begun to question this approach because it seems to underestimate your empathy. We don't have to paint for you the what-if scenario. There are already people whose lives have been torn apart by nuclear weapons, and we hope that as people of faith, you have the compassion and the prophetic imagination to be moved by their stories. Between 1945 and 1996, nuclear weapons were tested in 16 countries, often on sacred, indigenous land, with fallout spreading far beyond, including to Canada. In January, Emily and I visited Christmas Island in the Republic of Kiribati in the Pacific Ocean. We met the president of the Association of Survivors of the 33 UK and US nuclear weapons tests in Kiribati, at that time a British colony. She told us of how frightening it was to be a child growing up during the time of testing. Soldiers gathered residents in the main plaza, telling them to face away from the explosion. But small children, antsy, sometimes squirmed out of their parents' grasp, and at the dreadful moment of detonation, they were blinded by the flash in the sky. She told us that many other survivors suffer health problems consistent with radiation exposure. Christmas Island is a crucial nesting ground and migration stop for its population of 6 million birds. The nuclear tests scorched and blinded thousands of them. Fish and foliage were also destroyed in this fragile, complex ecosystem. Remember then that to threaten the use of a nuclear weapon is to threaten the instant slaughter of thousands of people, as well as animals and plants. It is to condemn babies not yet born to lives of suffering. Setsuko Thurlow, Japanese-Canadian survivor of the Hiroshima bombing, who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN, said, "Each person who died had a name. Each person was loved by someone." This is all very upsetting and seems utterly intractable. But the global extent of nuclear harm means there are opportunities for solidarity across national and religious boundaries. Learning about the suffering of nuclear survivors close to home may enable us to have empathy for those further away. It creates possibilities for collective action. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, was founded in 2007 to rejuvenate nuclear disarmament politics. With member organizations around the world, we have successfully pushed the multilateral conversation about nuclear weapons to focus on the humanitarian, the human rights, and the environmental dimensions, rather than narrow conceptions of national security. In 2017, 122 countries negotiated and adopted a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons at the UN in New York. Those of us working on ICAN's advocacy persuaded those governments to frame the treaty in moral and ethical terms, stressing the gendered impact of radiation and the disproportionate harm to indigenous peoples. The treaty categorically prohibits nuclear weapons and establishes a framework for assisting victims and remediating contaminated environments. As the treaty's preamble puts it, nuclear weapons are abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. Most weapons that we now consider pariahs, like chemical and biological weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions, were first banned by a smaller group of countries, often led by those without large arsenals. ICAN and the governments adopting the treaty decided to apply the same strategy to nuclear weapons. What we can control is their meaning. The treaty is well on its way to entry into force, despite the opposition of nuclear-armed states and some of their allies, including Canada. At the end of 2017, ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve the treaty. We were humbled and grateful for the prize. It has enabled ICAN to re-energize the public conversation about the ongoing dangers and harms of nuclear weapons.